Welcome, everybody. Ryan Charles. Welcome to episode number 3 of the OTS Producers Podcast, Over the Shoulder, in which you follow along with me, an indie producer, as I attempt to take a movie from script to screen, basically. So we had a little intro episode, then we covered basically talking about the different clearances that you'll have to get for the actual property that you want to turn into a movie. Now we focused mostly on purchasing a spec script, although we did also briefly cover if you were going to hire somebody to do drafts, this and that. But what if you wanted to buy somebody's life rights to turn that into a movie? Well, that's slightly different, and there are a few more clauses and sort of legalities involved. So I just wanted to pull that out and do a quick little mini episode on life rights. Now, a lot of these new streaming companies and whatnot, they're creating material themselves from scratch right now, their own content. And this is because that's cheaper than licensing out somebody else's content. This is kind of the same mindset you could have with when you're looking for something to make into a movie. Do you really want to spend all the money to pay somebody to write a movie for you, or to buy a script, or do you just want to do it yourself? Then you own it through and through. You don't have to buy it from somebody. It makes things a lot easier. Now, if you're making it up from scratch, that is even more easier because you don't have to get any additional rights. But if you are going to use somebody's life as an inspiration, whether it's a stranger, whether it's a family member, whether it's a famous person, you do have to get a number of, what you'd call life rights, essentially. But life rights aren't actually just one right. Life rights are sort of a bundle of a number of rights. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a producing genius. I'm getting a lot of this information out of Litwack and from a number of really great producers that I've been able to study under and to work with and to speak with, and I've heard speak on stage at different panels. And so what I want to do for this episode is basically just run down some notes that I took on a lot of these different life rights. And then we are going to take a look real fast at a depiction release form. Just kind of scroll through and see what the actual contract looks like for something like this. So yeah, like I said, it's actually a bundle of rights, things like defamation protection, basically giving up your right to invasion of privacy, rights to publicity, things like that. Now, you also may need to, in some cases, get the cooperation of additional people, of estates, of family members and whatnot, and additional releases for things like if that person kept diaries of some kind, if that person had correspondence, letters with somebody, you might need to get additional things for that. Now, you kind of have to ask yourself at the get-go a couple of big questions. For starters, are they alive or are they dead? If they're alive, you're going to have to get a lot more of these rights. All of these things basically you're going to need to get. If they're dead, chances are you don't need to, because dead people cannot sue for defamation of character. They cannot sue for libel, and those rights do not extend to families, to estates. So that is why, unfortunately, you see sometimes people who have deceased get a movie made about them. Their family comes out afterwards and is like, what the heck? That's not at all what that was like. They kind of don't really have much recourse except in the public, in the social spheres, on the internet and whatnot. So that's really what they have to do. Now, if a public figure is involved, if they're not private, if they are public, if they're in the public domain, a politician, somebody like George W. Bush, they didn't need to specifically get his life rights to make W, because he is a widely known public figure, and he's sort of fair game. Now, while defamation rights, libel, these things don't extend to a family if a person's deceased, a family still does, a state, these people will still own certain materials of that person. So, for instance, there was a Jimi Hendrix biopic made a number of years ago with Andre 3000 in it. I forget the exact title. I think it was Jimmy, All Is By Your Side, maybe, or something like that. And it featured Jimi Hendrix as a younger man before he became famous, when he was living in London, England. And this was, a really interesting look at his unknown years. But it was, in my opinion, perhaps mostly due to the fact that you can't really make a movie about Jimi Hendrix beyond him becoming big and famous, because the family notoriously will not give rights to the songs for people to do that. So the only songs you saw and heard Jimmy playing in the movie were all blues standards, things that he would have been playing before he really became famous. songs, and you don't hear any of his famous songs in it. So while they can't stop you from making a movie about somebody who's deceased, they can make it rather difficult in many different ways. Like I said, public officials are, they basically have a higher burden of proof when it comes to defamation, when it comes to libel, and so that makes it prohibitively more difficult for them to sue you if you do make a movie about them, and there is something that they're going to fight you on. Now, if there is something that you do think that you might get in trouble for, legitimately, and the person would have a legitimate claim in a lawsuit, you may want to just change the name, change a couple details, change it enough in the script, in the movie, so that it isn't clear that you're talking about that specific person. Now, they might still try and sue you anyway, but at least you're going to be protected in a bigger way. Famously, Citizen Kane is about William Randolph Hearst, but they changed the name, they changed enough of the details so that you could say that it's not really him. Now, as far as secondary characters go, you may need to get rights from those people too. If you're making a movie about somebody and their family features prevalently in it, you will need to get those people's rights as well. Now, in addition to that, you will need to get specific rights on how much you're going to use the life rights, basically. So is it just going to be for this one movie? Is it a one-off? Is it going to be for sequels as well? Are you going to include in there if it's going to go to a TV show, alternate media, streaming? All these things you need to think about ahead of time. Just as with when you're selling a script, buying a spec, or anything like that, is it local only? Is it international rights? All these things. Now, also, if you are the indie producer who's buying the life rights from somebody, generally you will also in there have a clause that assigns you the right to assign the rights to somebody else down the line. Let's say if you are a production company, you want to be able to transfer those rights to somebody else so that they can do the sequel, maybe, which you would have included in the clause up above so that you'd have those rights. Now, life rights are similar in scripts in that you could do just an outright purchase of a life right, or you could do an option with a purchase agreement, which is generally what I would recommend. I would imagine a lot of people would. Again, you don't want to just buy something outright if you don't know you'll ever actually be able to get it made. You want to option it and have the stipulation be, if it gets made, I'll pay you the money to buy the actual life rights. Now, as far as all this goes, you do generally have reversion clauses, just like with purchasing the script. If you do option it and or then end up purchasing it as well, if the movie doesn't get made in X amount of time, usually a year, let's say, then the rights revert back to that person. Their life rights revert back to themselves, basically. Now, regardless of what kind of deal you're striking here, what the stipulations, what the details are, you always need some form of consideration. Okay? Consideration is basically just another way of saying payment. So you need to pay them of some way, shape, or form. Whether it's $1, whether it's $10, whether it's an exchange of services, which it can be, it just has to be something. It can't just be for nothing. Generally, it's recommended to, even if it's $1 or $10, pay by a check. That way you can then get a copy of that check after it's cashed, and that's the proof, the legal proof of that consideration. Now, remember, I'm not a lawyer, so a lot of these things I'm saying you should definitely be researching on your own, become your own advocate. Again, I keep saying that. That's what this podcast is about, me teaching you a little bit of what I know, but also me learning more of what I don't know to kind of force you guys to learn more of what you don't know. And one thing I always find fascinating is that for life rights, oftentimes you're dealing with people who aren't professional, screenwriters, professional content makers. They're just regular people. And you might say, well, is a verbal handshake, a verbal agreement and a handshake enough? Well, technically, legally, in this country, it really is. Now, I would recommend at least having one witness on either side. Otherwise, you're just going on somebody's word in court. But technically, legally, if you have a verbal agreement in place and you have a handshake on that, and there is some form of consideration or even a promise of consideration, that is legally binding. So you need to be careful who you tell things to at parties. Again, going back from our previous clearance episode with the Stranger Things fiasco right now going on, make sure you have your bases covered, okay? Now, you could also promise somebody back end points for their life rights, but I mean, personally, when I hear back end, I hear no money at all ever. So I don't like to offer that to somebody else who might not know that that's basically what that means. A lot of people think everybody in Hollywood, all these movie makers make a lot of money, but the truth is that they don't really. We know that. Now, there's also usually a warranties and representations clause in the contract, which basically just says that the person whose life rights you're buying cannot sue you for defamation of character, for invasion of privacy, because they're giving these rights to you, basically. And this is especially important because there is usually, generally, always a clause that says, even though we're buying your life rights, we now have the right to fictionalize anything about your life, to make up things wholesale, to have characters say things that they never said, to have fake characters. Like, you can pretty much do whatever you want with somebody's life once you buy the life rights, as long as you have that clause in there, and it generally always is. So that's why it is important to get the clause saying, we won't sue you if you do this, if you defame me, if you do that, because you might not be doing that on purpose. It might not be the actual truth of the matter, but for the narrative of the story to work, you might have to push things a little further into what wasn't really the case. And you don't want to not be able to do that because you're going to get sued for defamation of character or libel or something like that. Now, also, I just like to point out, and remember, anybody who's seen People versus Larry Flint knows this, that parody, if you're parodying somebody, you also don't have to cover yourself with a lot of these rights, but it has to very clearly be parody. And definitely watch the movie if you don't know what I'm talking about. So the last thing before we hop into the actual contract is just the period portrayed, basically. It could exclude certain incidents. It could exclude certain time frames. It could only be certain time frames. It could also basically say you can use these characters, but you can't talk about my sister. You can't talk about my father. You also give the subject in the negotiations to have control over what it's billed as, basically. Is it based on a true story, inspired by actual events? All of those wordings you see in the beginning of movies, they're very specific, and depending on how much they end up making up from the actual life story and how much they end up using that's actually true, the person whose life rights it are might want to have it say inspired by instead of based on true events or something like that. So let's just dive into a couple of quick depiction release forms here, okay? We've got one that's a little bit longer, one that's a little shorter. Let's just cover the short, more casual one first. So this is basically just, you put the date here, you're sending this to the person whose life rights you want to get. Pleasure speaking with you, I'm interested in producing, this letter is intended to set forth a basic agreement, blah, blah, blah. The agreement is as follows. In consideration of $1,000, okay, that's a little much, I might go for $10 just for the option. Mutual promises and other valuable consideration. You grant my company, or whatever your company is, the exclusive and irrevocable right to option the motion picture, television, and all allied ancillary and subsidiary rights for the period of 1 year from the date of signing this agreement. Big shall have the right to extend the initial period, additional year by sending notice for another $2,000, blah. So the options, we're going to pay you $1,000, and then in a year, if we haven't exercised the option, we're going to pay you $2,000 to extend it. We promise to make our best efforts to produce this thing, and we'll act in accordance to this agreement. If the option is exercised, we shall compensate you even more based on this stuff. So if it's television, TV movie of the week, MOW, we pay you this. If it's a theatrical motion picture, we pay you this. If it's a television series, we pay you this. All consideration described will be payable with completion of principal photography. Not the beginning of it, not right now when the contract's signed, but completion of principal. Consulting services. You agree to serve as creative consultant concerning any production. You shall receive $1,000 per week for these services. So if you're on the set, not to exclude 4 weeks though, unless we both agree, it's probably a 4-week shoot. That's all they'll need. If you're required to travel more than 50 miles, we shall pay for it to get there. Before the time that the option is exercised, at Big's request, you shall disclose without compensation information under your possession relating to your life story. We'll consult with any writer, hire Big and share your observations, recollections, opinions. So basically this means you will need to sit down and talk to our writer if we want you to. You need to pick up the phone and answer if we call to ask you a question about something before we exercise the option. So before we've paid you this consulting money, you do kind of have to be a little bit of a consultant without compensation. If the option is exercised, the company will obtain perpetual, exclusive right to depict you, whether wholly or partially factual or fictional, and to use your name and likeness and voice and biography concerning the material, any production of the advertising and exploitation of all in all media. Okay, so we can use you, your story, but we can make stuff up as well, and we can put it anywhere we want. It is our intention to portray it factually, but You have the right to include such factional or fictional events, scenes, situations, and dialogues as may be considered desirable or necessary in discretion. So we can make stuff up if we want to, okay? It's very important to understand that. You agree to use best efforts to obtain, at no additional cost, releases. So if you have, if the person whose life rights you're getting, they are responsible for getting you paperwork, for signing over these life rights, from getting their lawyer in order in a timely fashion. They understand that you buying your life rights will not be obligated to actually exercise any of these rights or to initiate the production. So just because I'm doing this agreement with you doesn't mean I actually have to ever make this movie. I'm not legally required to make it. May freely sell, assign license rights under this agreement. So this is, again, if you want to assign these rights to somebody later on, you have the right to do that. You agree to execute other assignments or instruments necessary to expedient to carry out and effectuate the purposes and intent of this agreement. So that just means, again, you agree that you're going to do the paperwork, that you're going to actually push this through with the pen to paper and give me the rights. You agree to execute complete long-form agreement with customary language covering grants of biographical rights in full release, which will waive any claims or actions you may have against us from arising from the exercise of any of its rights under this agreement. So yes, we'll have a longer agreement that will cover the specific rights of what we get to use in your life and what we don't. Like I was saying before, it might exclude some time periods, it might exclude some people, some details, etc. No breach of this agreement shall entitle you to terminate or rescind the rights granted to me by getting these rights, and you hereby waive the right, in the event of any such breach, to equitable relief or to enjoin, restrain, or interfere with the production, distribution, exploitation, or exhibition of any television program or feature film about your life story, it being my understanding that your sole remedy shall be to recover money damages with respect to any such breach. So for what I'm seeing, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but this says that no breach of this agreement. So if I do breach this agreement, you can't terminate the rights to this still, but you can come after me for damages. So you can't stop me from making the movie, but you can come after me for damages after the fact. I think that's what that's saying. But again, I'm not perfect. I'm not knowing all. No producer is. So let's just keep moving here. This agreement shall be governed and controlled by the laws of the state of California. Okay, so this will change depending on what state you're in. If you're in New York, it'll be that. And again, depending on what state you're in, you have to bring this to a lawyer who knows those states' laws, and you will have to spend some money on it, and then you do the signing over there. So real quickly, there's another one over here that's just a little bit longer. We're not going to go through it line by line like we did the other one because it's a lot of the same thing, but there were some slightly different things that I just wanted to cover real fast. And again, this is California. This is just an example from Litlock, so it'll be specific to your state. So yeah, I understand your desire to use all parts of life, distribute and exhibit and exploit everywhere. I have agreed to grant you the certain rights, the consent, consideration, royalty, full knowledge I grant you perpetually and irrevocably unconditional exclusive rights throughout the world, blah, blah, blah. This is just more specific. It's getting into, motion pictures, sound recordings, publications, any or all other media without limiting, theatrical, television, dramatic stage, radio, sound recording, music publishing, commercial, tie-in, merchandising, advertising, publicity rights. So this is just a longer contract. It's a lot more specific, which you're going to want to be. You're going to want to be specific and be longer-winded if it calls for it. I mean, again, you need to act as if this movie is going to make $50 million and get distributed internationally, so you have to have your bases covered from the beginning. Further understood, again, that it may be used in a manner by any means, either factually or fictionalization, impersonation, simulation, imitation, modification, you get it. Payment, here's just more of the payment. Release, this is the same thing. I hereby have for libel, defamation, invasion of privacy, right to publicity, infringement of copyright, all these other rights, violations coming out or relating to the utilization of these granted rights, they're not going to see. They're releasing all that to you. Name and pseudonym. This basically says you can use my name if you want to, but you can also change it if you want to. You're not required to do it. Further documents, same from before, they're required to get you the documents that you need to prove that the rights have come your way. Remedies, again, this is just that they're not gonna, no breach of the contract can entitle them to terminate that. They can only sue you back in court. Public domain, also this says basically if there's things in the script that weren't solely from this person's life rights, but were from the public domain, like George W. Bush, there were stories in there that were in the public domain. So another author, another film writer, and this person whose life rights you're purchasing, they can totally use those things in other places as well, and you can't stop them because that's in the public domain. So it doesn't extend to that. All right, and now there's just a couple more little things down over here. More legalities, arbitration. If you do end up suing, each party waives the right to adjudicate, courts, entire understanding. This consent expresses the entire understanding. This is pretty boilerplate with the things. Assignment, you can assign this agreement and rights granted herein to other people at other times. And again, it goes specifically into the state of California, which you're going to change depending on your state. And then you've got your signatures down over here. The last thing I want to say is just to be clear that you can put defamatory information about people into movies. You just have to make sure that it's true. Now, if you do put something in and maybe you thought it was true, but it turns out that it wasn't, and you do get sued, you could still be protected as long as you've gotten your E&O insurance, and especially if you've proven by things like annotating your script, of showing where you got the source of where you got that information from. These things will help because essentially, in order to prove a defamation suit, it has to be shown that you acted with malice, basically, with intent, that you knew that it was wrong and you said it, you put it in there anyway because you wanted to hurt somebody. Now, again, there's lots of great sources out there beyond just me for these sorts of things. Litwalk is a great one. It's got entire chapters devoted to things like trademark, like copyright, like defamation of persons and literary purchases and material and stuff like that. But then there is this also other really great book, which is Bound by Law. This was done by the University of Duke Center for the Study of the Public Domain. So this would be helpful when researching when you can use something without having to get the rights for it. If it's in the public domain, copyright laws, histories, case studies, different examples that it's told in this cool sort of like comic book sort of method that's easy to understand. There it is. Quick little, well, maybe not as quick as we thought it was going to be, but life rights, different from acquiring releases for scripts or hiring a writer to do something, so covering it separately. We are going to cover next in another little mini episode just E&O insurance. We covered it briefly at the tail end of clearances during episode 2, but I thought it was important enough to pull out early and just give you guys a broader view of it, not just from the perspective of the material, the IP that you're licensing, but from all the things that you'll need to get and know and keep track of along the way of us producing our movie in order to get E&O insurance, which you need if you're going to get distributed in any way, shape, or form. So tune in for the next episode, episode 4, where we'll cover E&O insurance, and then beyond that, episode 5, we're finally going to dive into the WGA minimum basic agreement contract, and we're going to have our first guest where I'm going to be interviewing an actual writer about this process from their angle. So there it is, Ryan Charles, Nitty Gritty Studios, the OTS Over the Shoulder Producers Podcast. Tune in next time.